Hi guys, welcome. I'm just gonna give everybody a minute to get settled and see. It looks like some other people are joining us. So I'm just gonna give everybody a minute to join audio and we'll be getting started in a minute or two here. All right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and get started just for sake of time. If I look a little distracted, it's just because people keep joining the waiting room and I have to admit them. So I apologize for that in advance. My name is Jen Fleming, and I am the Career Advisor for Education, Nonprofit, and Government in the Career Center. And so usually I am in all of the student-teacher mandatory meetings. And I come and talk about how to create a student teaching resume. And you may have seen like a little video I put together that Kate Liston might have showed. But really the point of hosting this little workshop was so that you guys could get a good basis and foundation of what that student teaching resume should look like. So we're going to be going through a short presentation. I don't think it's going to take us the full hour. We'll definitely have time for questions at the end as well. And I will share the presentation with you guys as well. And then I'll probably be putting a few different resources in the chat, just different links to things, and showing you like a few different examples of resumes as well. So if everybody can stay on mute until they have a question, that's always helpful just so I don't get distracted. But I will try to also pause periodically. So I'm going to be sharing my screen so you guys can see the presentation. I'll pause periodically to see if questions are coming up after some of the different sections of the resume that we're talking about. And then if not, you can definitely ask questions at the end. So with that, I am going to go ahead and share my screen here. And like I said, you guys will have access to this. And first, going to start talking about kind of the foundation of a teaching resume or student teaching resume rather. So a few things. We want it to look good. So it says aesthetic, making sure that it looks good, it's clear, concise, is going to be really important. And then thinking about making sure the content is solid. So we'll talk about ways to make sure that your content is good. And I'll show you some examples. We'll have entry lines for all of your experience sections, and underneath we'll have bullets. And so when we say content, we're talking about those bullet statements, and we'll talk about how to kind of create those. And then the last piece, of building a resume is really editing. So making sure that you're taking that final look. It's one thing to make it look good and make the content look good, but I will say that can be quite the process, to the point where a lot of times people get tired, and by the time they get to the editing process, they're like, it's good to go. Let me just hand it in. But I do really encourage you to, either make an appointment to meet with me or another advisor in the Career Center, or making sure somebody is taking additional eyes on this document. And the nice thing is, because you guys do have this requirement of creating the student teaching resume for the application, to be placed for student teaching, it sets you up so that when you go to update this after student teaching, you're in a good place. You already have this document and you know what to do. It's more about updating it with that student teaching experience and maybe taking some things out to prioritize and make room for that specific experience. So a few different things we're going to talk about. There are going to be some mandatory sections of the document that we'll definitely have to include. Then there'll be some different ways to show experience. And so this will look different for each individual. So just depending on what your experience has been, and we'll talk about that. And then some optional sections. So here I have just like a very simple resume example. And hopefully you guys can see that okay. And I'm going to be sharing some more samples with you guys. But you'll notice that it's one page, so it does have to stay to one page, so keep that in mind as you're creating your document. And you'll notice maybe a few things that look a little different than like an average resume of maybe somebody who's not student teaching. One is that licensure section. So licensure is a section that shows the license that we're expecting you to get. So even though you don't have that license yet, we are going to include the license you will get upon graduation and fulfilling all your requirements. So everybody who's doing student teaching will be getting a professional educator license. And then depending on the program that you're in or the specific content area that you're doing, you'll get additional endorsements. A lot of people get one endorsement, some people get multiple endorsements, but you'll notice that those are listed underneath where it says professional educator license. And so that'll be that very first section. And then after that, we'll have your education section. So both of these sections are going to be considered mandatory in that we need to have those on there. One thing I didn't point out, which is kind of, yeah.
Quick question. Is this PowerPoint going to be available after?
It definitely will
awesome.
be. I'll send it to everybody who RSVP'd afterwards.
Awesome, thanks.
It might not be until tomorrow, but I will make sure that everybody gets it. The one thing I did not mention is obviously this identification section at the top. You'll definitely, of course, want to include that. For that, you can do city, state, zip. You don't have to do your full address. And then definitely your phone number and your email address. For the email address, make sure that it's something professional. So, you know, not skaterdude360, you know, at hotmail.com type of thing. Something professional. And if you don't have that professional email yet, now is a very good time to create one when you're thinking about continuing on in your program and eventually applying to full-time positions. So I'll come back to the education section. Like I said, this will be the next like section header that you'll have to have on the document. For those of you that are master students, you'll have DePaul as your first entry because that's the most recent. And then you'll have your undergraduate institution listed underneath. And then for those of you that are undergrad students, you'll just have DePaul. If you have attended another school and you received a degree, so you've received, say, maybe like an associate's degree, and then you came to DePaul to do your bachelor's, you would include that. If you are a transfer student and you just took classes, maybe at a community college, and then you transferred to DePaul and you never received a degree at that other institution, then you wouldn't necessarily include that. So keep that in mind. The other thing to note is I would recommend including your GPA if it's a 3.0 or higher. If it's not a 3.0 or higher, you can go ahead and leave that off. And you'll notice for the professional educator license and like the current degree that you're working on, both have expected dates, right? So we're expecting to graduate in, you know, June of 2021 or 2022 or whatever it is. I do want to pull up really quickly. A sample. I actually meant to throw this one in the presentation. So I will attach this in the email. This one's just a little bit updated. So we can go off of this for like your example. You will notice a few different things just in terms of formatting. Everything is clear and concise, right? And we, you know, aren't having a lot of differences just in terms of like, you know, I'm going to bold this thing and then I'm going to italicize this and then I'm going to bold this one and then I'm going to italicize, right? We're not getting too wild with the, you know, design of it. And I would say, you know, if you have to have color, you could make like your section headers a certain color, but this isn't necessarily where like your creative side is going to come out. You know, these documents for education, specifically in my career community in particular, are going to be, you know, a little bit boring, right? We're going to let your experience speak for itself rather than, you know, having design elements and, you know, a picture of yourself or something like that. So keep that in mind. I don't recommend using like a template of any sort. I recommend just like a plain old Microsoft Word document or a Google Doc, and you're doing the formatting yourself. And I know that can feel like a little bit hard, like how exactly do I format it? You can use any of the samples that I send to you and share with you as your own. If you want to change certain elements about it, again, without getting like too wild, to make it your own, I recommend doing that. And then a few other things to kind of notice. Font size. The lowest font size you ever want to go is about 10 points. I would not go lower than that. I would say 10.5 or 11 really is more ideal. And then if you're somebody who maybe is an undergraduate student, you haven't had a ton of experience yet, you might even have 12-point font to take up more room, because we have to stay to one page in the resume, but we also want to make sure it's a full page. We don't want to have like a half a page or anything like that. So let's go back here. And this kind of just reiterates what I just mentioned. So again, you guys will have access to this, and talks about the mandatory sections. You can include honors in the education section as well. So keep that in mind if you don't want to have a whole section devoted to it, because again, you have to only keep to that one page. You can add that there. The other thing is like study abroad. You can put in the education section as well. So, you know, think about that too. But then in terms of showing experience, a few things we're going to want to consider. And again, this will look different for everyone. If you're somebody who has teaching related experience, that would be your next section header. So this would be your first experience section header. And this would be anything related to teaching. So, you know, if you've done like an academic enrichment program over the summer where you were, you know, doing tutoring or leading small groups or things of that nature. You know, if you were nannying and there was a big component of, you know, assisting students with homework help and some of that tutoring aspect, it could go in there. So anything that's related to teaching will go in this section. You could also potentially have a teaching experience section if you've been a substitute teacher. So if you've been a substitute teacher, that would actually go in the teaching section, and that would go above teaching related. A lot of times people maybe haven't had that experience just yet. And so you can do teaching related and put anything that feels related to teaching there. And then if you haven't had teaching related experience yet, that's okay. I would then think about your interactive field experience. So I know right now with COVID, things are a little bit weird in terms of observation hours and having the opportunity to do some of that. It's fine to include an entry like detailing the teaching channel. And what I would say is I would just make sure, and we'll talk about this in a second when we talk about content, just making sure that your bullets are like action oriented, right? So you're not just talking about like observing something. And I would say this is true in general about this section. We don't want to talk about just the fact that we're observing, but we want to show we're taking like an active role. I know that looks a little different when you're literally watching the teaching channel. But if you've gone in person, I would think about like consulting with the lead teacher about classroom management strategies. Or if you are going to talk for the teaching channel about, you know, kind of more that observation side of things, I would be very specific about what you're doing. So like maybe it's less about observing and you're more analyzing. So maybe you're analyzing different classroom management techniques, but think about it in a very active way. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about how to create those bullets, but I just want to point that out. And then for that specific section, I don't recommend, if you have, you know, gone in person for your observation hours, listing everywhere you've gone. I would choose 2 to 3 of the places that you've gone that has felt like more in depth, where maybe you were able to run a small group or that type of thing, so that you have some of that content to create that entry. If you're somebody who has had a lot of teaching related experience, you might not even necessarily include the interactive field experience. Okay, so don't feel like you have to have that if you have a ton of teaching related experience. What I would say is I would prioritize teaching related experience first, because this is something you've chosen to do, whereas the interactive field experience is something that is mandatory through your program. And I'm going to just pause for a second here. Questions that are coming up so far about any of that?
I asked this
I thought
one
I
in the
heard
chat.
someone.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Sophia, you can go first.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, my headphones are really weird, so when I have a question, I have to turn it off. But so I worked as a CPS volunteer in a high school and was running dance classes basically during the school day as part of the curriculum and chaperoning field trips and stuff. And I was wondering where that might fit in, if it does at all.
Yeah, definitely. I would absolutely include that. I would put that in teaching related for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely include that, especially if you're wanting to student teach in CPS, but even if you're wanting to student teach elsewhere, that sounds like a great, related experience. So please include that for sure. Good question though. Kelly, did you have a question?
Yeah, I sent it through in the chat. Just a quick question.
Cool.
I just was wondering, should we use our DePaul email address or should we use a personal one?
Yeah, so that's a good one. So what I would say is it's up to you, especially for the student teaching aspect of this. I think it's fine to use your DePaul one. Once you get through and you're actually in student teaching and you're thinking about that full-time job search, I would probably say to switch to a personal one. Maybe it's even one that you only use for the job search. Whichever one you choose, technically either one is fine. I think the tough one with the DePaul one for the full-time job search is maybe you stop using that after you graduate and you might still be looking for a position over the summer. So it might not feel as relevant then. So that's why I say, maybe think about a personal one then. But especially right now, if that's the one that you're checking, I would use whatever one you're actually checking. And so again, since you're still very much in your program, and applying to student teaching, using the DePaul one is totally fine.
Great, thank you.
And then, yes, of course. And then I just saw from Catherine, the undergrad GPA 2, yes, I would include that also if it's a 3.0 or higher.
Cool. And then a follow-up to that, when you're saying about prioritizing teaching experience versus the part of our program experience, from a career change perspective, would you say highlighting career change relatable skills instead of kind of the field experience, if that feels more priority?
We're actually going to talk about that next.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, good question. So let me share screen here because we're going to talk about a few additional sections here. So the next one is professional experience. And so Catherine, this is probably what you're talking about, where maybe you've worked in a different industry, and this is very common with teaching, maybe working in a different industry for a period of time and then coming back to get your master's in teaching. And so for this, what I would say is just making sure that you don't have an entire page of, graphic design, right? So I would say include your most recent 1 or 2 experiences in a professional experience section. But I would put that after the interactive field experience. So I would do teaching related if you have it, and then interactive field experience, and then professional experience. And so for the professional experience, I would also think about transferable skills. If there were opportunities where you trained people, anything like that, I would definitely be highlighting. But again, I would recommend keeping it to probably your most recent 2 opportunities that you had, or experiences that you had rather, in that other industry. Another thing, volunteer experience. What I will say about this is if you did volunteer experience, so someone just asked, I think it was Sophia, where it's volunteer experience, but it's related to teaching, put that in teaching related and your position will be volunteer, your position title. But then if you have volunteer experience that maybe isn't related to teaching, maybe you volunteer at a soup kitchen every week and you want to show like that community involvement aspect, that would go in volunteer experience. But again, if it's related to teaching, put it in teaching related as that first section so that it's highlighted nice and at the top of that document. So some optional categories, leadership experience. So, you know, especially if you've been really involved at DePaul or even like within your community, you could also do like community involvement. Those would be things that you could definitely highlight. Coaching experience, especially if you do want to coach, you could have a separate section just about coaching experience. Skills and interests, I will say this is an important one if you have something to put in it. For this section, I recommend things that are very concrete. So we're not necessarily going to put in here like good communicator or something like that. We're going to be very specific. You know, maybe you're fluent in another language, or maybe you have very specific technology skills. You know, you're very proficient in Google Classroom or things of that nature. That would go in this section. In terms of the interest side of things, I would say this can be a little bit more personal than maybe you're thinking. So this could actually be, you know, if you, you know, play guitar and you're really interested in doing an after-school club around playing guitar, I would put, you know, experienced in guitar, eager to start after-school activity. So the idea with the interest piece of this section is that you're showing that there are potentially other skills or professional interests that you can bring to the table in the form of extracurricular programming. So I wouldn't put something on there if it's more like your me time. So if you're really into yoga, but you know that's what you do for self-care and it's not necessarily something you're willing to do after school, don't put, you know, experienced in yoga, eager to start after school program, and you get there and they ask and you're like, no, I don't really want to do that. So just be careful, you know, what you're choosing to put in there. But I would think about, you know, if you're great at cooking and you'd be interested in that, if there's certain like social justice things or like cultural things, I would think about all of those and put that you're willing to take on those additional responsibilities. Honors and activities, you can have a section around this, but again, you might have those honors in that education section. Professional development and memberships, if you, you know, have attended conferences or something like that, you could include it. Again, study abroad, you could have a separate section, or you could include just like a line within your education section if you need to save room. And then related coursework. I would say this section is really only for maybe undergrad students who don't have a ton of experience yet, and we're trying to fill up that page a little bit more. And so this section would go after your education section, and it would, you know, be related coursework, and you would list your higher level education course. Otherwise, this would be probably the first one I would not necessarily include. So this just talks a little bit, again, kind of some of the key points just in terms of like not using templates, you know, being consistent with your font and alignment, editing. And again, you guys will have access to this, but I am going to, actually, I'm going to share this one more time. And again, I'll attach this in that follow-up email, but you'll notice, again, they have teaching related experience. They have interactive field experience, and then they have some leadership experience and skills and interests. So again, this will all depend on what your experience has been. So feel free to kind of use this as an example. And then on this second page, it talks about each of these sections. So it gives a little blurb of information, you know, things that I mentioned, you know, today, and even talks a little bit about some of those optional or additional sections. I'm going to stop really quick from sharing and see what questions come up before we talk about how do we actually create these bullet statements that are going to be the bulk of the document. Okay, so we have a few questions in the chat here. So for study abroad, what if we did an academic program outside of DePaul? that is fine. I would, was it like a quarter or semester long for a short-term one?
Yeah, so it was before I started college actually, but it was like a month-long like immersive French and art program like in France.
Mm.
There was like, you know, a curriculum developed and like assessments and everything throughout it, and also having like the immersive experience in the French culture.
Sure.
So I kind of wanted to list
Yeah.
it somewhere.
Yeah, definitely list it. I'm jealous. Sounds awesome. What I would say is I would probably do, like, if you're an undergrad student, I would do your DePaul entry, and then I would leave a space. So like normally I'd have you like include it, depending on how we write it, right underneath that DePaul entry. But leave a line, and then I would write out the program's name and do, you know, study abroad program or whatever like they called it, and you'll put the date. So you'll put, you know, whenever it happened. So if people are paying attention to the dates on your resume, they'll realize it's something that you did prior to DePaul. And even if they don't put that together, you're not putting it within DePaul's entry, and so it won't be assumed that it was technically through DePaul, but definitely include it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then in optional sections, will you put any certifications as well? Yeah, so what you could do actually, I would just be careful like what the certification is. So is it from like a, you know, respected institution? It's something kind of like not well known. It doesn't need to be well known, but you know, is it an actual certification? And if it is, then you could actually do a section header that's licensure and certification. I would still do the professional educator license first. I would leave a line and then do the name of the certificate. And if it's something that is not actually a certification and it's more like a certificate you got for completing a course or something like that, that's maybe not quite as involved, then I would maybe put that in like a professional development or training section, if that makes sense. And if you give me more context, I can tell you where to put it. And then if we have teaching experience with other age groups, yeah, I would still put that in a teaching experience section. Yeah, even if it's different age groups, that's totally fine. Okay, all good questions. Any other questions before we talk about that content?
I had a quick question. I have I'm certified as I have a public teaching certification for Hawaii. So not super relevant for Illinois, but would that be something to include under the licensure section?
Yeah, I would.
Cool.
Yep.
Thanks.
I definitely would. Good question. Okay, so I am going to share screen here. And oh, the other thing I'm just going to mention on the third page, I actually forgot it was on here. On the third page of this document that I'm going to send you guys, there's a little licensure cheat sheet that I created that just shows like what program, like what the actual language should be for the licensure section for you. So, you know, for early childhood, professional educator license, the expected month and year, and then early childhood education, birth to grade 2. So you'll put the endorsement and then the grade range. So take a look at that if that's helpful, in case you're wondering what that looks like specifically for your program. And then let's see here. I'm going to go back to here. Okay. So in terms of creating those bullets, like I said, you probably noticed there's entry lines for each experience that talks about like the organization, your position title, the location, the dates. But then underneath there are bullets that outline what your experience was. And so when you're thinking about creating those bullets, I will say the first few are going to be difficult. So just, you know, kind of go in with that expectation, and they will get easier. But I do think using what we call the bullet point formula is particularly helpful. So this is the formula: action verb plus example plus result. So every single bullet is starting with an action verb. So instruct, facilitate, coordinate, manage, whatever it may be, right? You're adding an example, and then a result. So the result might be why you're doing something or the intended outcome. And I think it's tough sometimes, like when it comes to some entries, whether it's maybe like customer service, where you're working at a restaurant, or even some teaching things, you're like, well, you know, of course I did this, you know, because this is what I'm supposed to do type of thing. It feels basic, I guess is my point. Think about it like at a very, very basic level. So why you might be doing something, you know, it might be to promote a positive learning environment, right? So it might be as basic as that, but it helps the reader to understand your experience a little bit more. So if you don't use that formula, it sounds like tutored an 8th grade student. If I'm reading that in the experience, I'm left with some questions, right? There's just not quite enough context there for me to really grasp what your experience has been. And people are looking at these pretty quick. You know, student teaching might be like a little bit of an exception here, but when you go to, you know, apply to things full time, you know, they're looking at them very quick. They're not going to take guesses about what your experience has been. We really want to be able to paint that picture for them. So in this second one, it's an example actually using the formula. So tutored an 8th grade student in geography using contemporary stories to strengthen engagement and critical thinking skills. Now I have a better idea of what that looks like, right? So being clear and concise, but also providing enough context. And what I would say a good like rule of thumb in terms of length, you know, you might have bullets that are 1 line, and you might have bullets that are 2 lines, depending on what you're including in there. I would say never go onto a 3rd line. You're going to kind of lose the reader at that point, and that's kind of a good indication that maybe you're including too much detail if you're going onto a 3rd line. So keep that kind of in the back of your mind as you're creating them. I'm going to pause there and see what questions are coming up just kind of regarding that content.
How do you feel about, how do you feel about semicolons? Like if you're elaborating on an example in 1 bullet versus like if it's all one related example? I'm
glad you brought this up. I'm not a fan. I think usually when people are using like colons or semicolons or even parentheses, a lot of times you're able to reword it so that it's like including blank, blank, and blank, and you're giving a few examples or additional context for something. And I would say if you're using a lot of semicolons, it might be that you actually like they're truly 2 different things that you are doing, and that might mean you need to do 2 different bullets for them. That's a great question though. Then Lauren asked, so just a question, this is a good thing to think about too. A specific question kind of more about timeline. So, you know, how far back do you go on your resume? What I will say is like the rule of thumb is 10 years. However, for those of you that are undergraduate students, you're not going to be including things that were 10 years ago, right? So it's 10 years for professionals who've been, you know, working for a decent amount of time. And so, you know, you're not including things that you did in middle school because you're, you know, a junior in college, right? So I would think about like, where are you at in your program? Are you a career changer and now you're, you know, in a master's program and you have a lot of, you know, past experience? Are you somebody who's, you know, straight from high school to undergrad? I would say if it's the case of you're coming straight from undergraduate and you're in college, at this point you're like a junior because you're applying to maybe student teaching. In that scenario, you know, you're kind of on the line. If you maybe had an opportunity like senior year that was like very specific teaching experience, like super, super related, you could go ahead and include it. If it was something from like early high school, I probably wouldn't. But if it feels like super, super related and it was at the very end of high school and you've kind of gone straight through, so there's not like a huge time gap, you could include that. Other questions that are coming up?
Kind of related to that, from a career changing perspective, if you have 10 years of career experience, is it weird to omit like the first job out of college if your more recent jobs were more related to transferable skills?
No, and I wouldn't necessarily include, depending on how many places you've been in those 10 years, I wouldn't include everything, especially if it's not related to teaching at all. Because they're gonna, they know that you're in a program, they're gonna care less about, that first job out of college that was maybe in graphic design or fashion or something else. They're not gonna be sitting there like, well, this date doesn't match up with this date.
Yeah.
They're more
That's what I was
thinking
thinking.
about, and I know that's sometimes the worry, but it's truly more about kind of that related experience. And then once you have student teaching experience, typically people take off the interactive field experience section to make room for the student teaching experience, and student teaching goes under teaching experience. So at that point, everyone has teaching experience. And then, again, prioritizing teaching related and possibly taking off interactive field experience if you need to. So yeah, don't worry about like specific dates lining up and that type of thing. Good question though.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Should we list our minor under education as well?
Yeah, so you can do, Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Science, whatever it may be in elementary education, whatever. And then on the next line, or even that line, you can do a semicolon minor in blank or on a second line. Either one is fine. But yeah, I would definitely include your minors. So I'm just going to show really quickly. So I'm going to give you guys the presentation, but then I am going to just really quickly show you two things here. So let me share my screen. Okay. So at the end of this slide, or sorry, at the end of this presentation, it talks about how you can make an appointment. So you can do that on Handshake. I have to warn you, you guys obviously all have the same deadline, which is why I'm glad we got like 10 people in here today. I think at this point, I'm totally booked for next week. So the opportunity for you guys to get in, get feedback, might be tough. If you feel like you sat in this presentation and you have lots of questions, I would honestly go on Handshake or call our office like the moment we get off this call, and try to get on my calendar for before February 12th. Otherwise, you have all the information. And what I will say is, you can email me. However, it's typically at least 5 business days. So keep that in mind with the deadline as well. And then I will, I always have a lot of people emailing me their stuff. So sometimes it can be even past that, just because I am typically mostly meeting with students throughout the day. So just kind of keep those things in mind, but you can make an appointment by calling our office during regular office hours or business hours, or going on Handshake, which I'll show you in 1 second. But I do just want to show you really quickly this page. So this is on the Career Center. If you guys haven't been on our website, I do recommend checking this out. So I'll actually go back to our main page here. I'm just going to point out our career library. There's a bunch of resources on here, and these are general, so these aren't necessarily specific to teaching, but just a lot of like really good information related to career. And so they're all organized by different categories, career related categories. And if you click on this, it takes you to the handout or the resource, and they're usually just 2 pages, so they're very digestible. I actually really like this one, the Know Your Brand. I think this can be helpful. Not that you necessarily are going to need it for the student teaching portion of it, but once you go for full-time positions, really being able to talk about these different things. How do you incorporate this within a cover letter, and how do you talk about it in an interview? And really making sure you have this cohesive brand and this cohesive story that you're able to articulate. So check out that career library. There's a lot of stuff in there, but then I do just want to show you under career advising, if you go to career communities, and I'll throw this in the chat, my page is under education, nonprofit, and government. And so there's resources if you click on these different things, but then there are teacher resources here. Again, some of this is going to be more specific to like full-time job search. So There's like professional development stuff, career development stuff, ISB, some comprehensive job search sites. So again, this will be more for the full-time stuff, but just some things to think about and know about. And then down here, this is our new student teacher resume guide. I'm going to send you guys the Word doc so that you have that and what that looks like. Kind of formatted wise, but then this has that same information on here. So I'm going to give you this whole page so that if you want to come back to this, and then this is a full guide, and this has samples in it as well. This needs to be updated, not the samples, but some of the content in here, just in terms of like, it talks about different programs we offer that we've changed. So keep that in mind. But you have this, which we talked about, and then again, some different samples. So you can take a look at some of those different samples to see if there's different things you want to do for yours. But there's a bunch in here. So I will give you that, this overall page so that you can come and look at any of this stuff. So I'm going to throw this in the chat. And I accidentally only sent that to Lauren. Hold on 1 second. Okay, there it is for everybody. And then I am just going to show you Handshake. And we'll take any last minute questions. And my computer's being a little slow here. And it's giving me an issue here for some reason. So this is the admin side. So let me just show you from the student side. If you guys haven't been on Handshake, I recommend checking it out. I feel like my education students use it less than some of my other students that I see. So on here, you can create a profile. And I would recommend doing that. And aside from the profile kind of looks a little bit like a LinkedIn profile. I would also fill out this career interests section, and you can opt into our career community, and that will give you a newsletter every 2 weeks, and that has like relevant programming that we have coming up, so like events and things of that nature, part-time jobs, things like that. So I would fill that out. It also helps for the most relevant information to be pushed towards you with the algorithm that this program uses. But I wanted to show you how to make an appointment. So you can click Career Center, Appointments, Schedule a new appointment. You can do phone or virtual right now, and then you just click on My Career Community, and then it will show. And right now, Ed Childs, because I've been booked out for a little while here, he's another career advisor who's seen lots of education students in his time in the Career Center, so he's also helped me out. So he'd be another good person to meet with. But you can click and make an appointment. And then I do just want to show you on here, because there's a lot of like tutoring positions or teaching related types of positions on here. These are where employers post their positions. So this is jobs that are off campus. So, might be an employer in, downtown Chicago or whatever. So like even something like this, youth enrichment instructor, gives the information, and then you can actually apply on here. So keep that in mind, because again, I think my education students know about it less, or are less likely to use it for whatever reason. But last minute questions, knowing that I will send that follow-up email, please make sure, I think all of you guys basically had to register or RSVP in Handshake to get the Zoom link, hopefully, because that is what I will be pulling in order to send the follow-up email. So as long as you're RSVP'd in Handshake, I'll be sending the presentation, that resume sample, and then the link to my page, which links to the additional resources I mentioned. Any last minute questions though, before we sign off here though? All right, nothing in the chat. So looks like we are good to go. But, you know, definitely, even if it's not before this deadline, feel free to come and meet with me at some point and kind of talk about your next steps. Super important, especially before you start that student teaching experience, to kind of get your ducks in a row so that you're feeling good going into that experience and not necessarily starting from scratch while you're also starting to student teach. But let me know if questions come up and feel free to make an appointment, okay?
Thank you.
All right, of course. Bye, guys. Have a wonderful day.